Hello, chess fans! Welcome back to the Chessventura Channel. In today's video, we're diving into a thrilling match played between the legendary Magnus Carlsen and Torstein Bae, which took place on April 13, 2006. Alright, without further ado, let's jump straight into the game. Here, Magnus Carlsen, playing as white, starts with pawn to e4, which black responds to with pawn to e5. Magnus follows up with knight to f3, and black replies with knight to c6. Magnus then develops his bishop to b5, pinning the knight and pressuring the e5 pawn. This opening is known as the Ruy Lopez. Black responds with knight to f6, employing the Berlin defense and attacking the e4 pawn. Magnus defends the pawn with d3, and black counters by advancing the pawn to d6, reinforcing the e5 pawn while preparing to develop the bishop to d7 to break the pin on the knight. Magnus then made a kingside castle, and black responded by advancing the pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g7. Magnus offered a pawn exchange by advancing his pawn to g4, aiming to open up the game. Torstein accepted the offer by capturing the pawn with his pawn on d4. Magnus then offered another pawn by pushing his pawn to e5, threatening the knight. Torstein again accepted the exchange, capturing the pawn with his pawn on e5. And this time, Magnus recaptured with his knight. Realizing that the knight and bishop were aligned on the same line, Torstein moved his queen to d5, threatening both the bishop and the knight. Magnus responded by moving his rook to e1, protecting the knight and, most importantly, setting up a discovered check. In this position, Torstein did not capture the white bishop but chose to move his bishop to e6. Let's analyze this choice. If the queen had captured the bishop, the knight would have taken the knight on c6, delivering a discovered check. The black bishop would have moved to e6 to block the check, and then the knight could have captured the pawn on d4, simultaneously attacking both the queen and the bishop. In this case, the white position would still be very strong, as the rook and queen would be positioned in the open file, which could be extremely dangerous for black. In the actual game, Torstein moved his white square bishop to e6 to block the discovered check from the white rook. Magnus continued by capturing the knight on c6, and then the pawn recaptured, threatening the white bishop. At this point, instead of saving the bishop, Magnus played knight to c3, sacrificing his knight. Let's analyze again. In this position, if black accepts the knight sacrifice by capturing the knight, the next move would be queen takes queen, leaving the bishop pinned by the rook and the pawn pinned by the bishop. Thus, only the knight could capture the white queen. Then, the white bishop would capture the pawn on c6, delivering a check while also forking the rook. After the black king moves to e7, the white bishop would capture the rook. This is a brilliant idea by Magnus Carlsen. In the actual game, black did not capture the knight but instead chose to move the queen to c5. Magnus responded by moving his queen to f3, attacking both the knight and the pawn on c6, while also exerting pressure on the bishop. This position is quite complex. If black captures the bishop, white would then capture the rook with a check. Torstein responded by moving the king to d7, protecting the pawn. Magnus then captured the knight with his queen, also attacking black's rook. Black then moved the bishop to e7, protecting the rook and simultaneously threatening the queen. Magnus, however, did not save his queen but instead counterattacked by moving his knight to e4, threatening black's queen. Black captured the white bishop with the queen, but Magnus recaptured the pawn on d4 with a check. The black queen moved to d5 to block the check, and Magnus chose to retreat his queen to c3. Black then moved the rook to b8, placing it on the semi-open file. Then, Magnus plays the bishop to g5, threatening the bishop while simultaneously creating a potential threat with the rook, pinning the black queen to the king on d1. In this position, if the black queen tries to escape, there are only two squares available, b5 and f5. However, both of these squares remain dangerous. For example, if the queen moves to b5, white can play rook to d1, delivering a check. Black's bishop would block the check, and white's queen would move to f6. Black's king would move to c8, and white's rook would capture the bishop on d6. If the pawn recaptures the rook, white's knight would take the pawn on d6, delivering a check and forking the queen. As a result, Black opted to capture the white bishop with the bishop on d5, and Magnus immediately played rook to d1, pinning the queen to the king. There was no other option for Torstein except to move the bishop to e7 to save it. Magnus wisely chose not to capture the queen with the rook, but instead delivered a check with his knight to f6, forking the queen. Once again, Black had no choice but to capture the knight with the bishop, and Magnus recaptured with the queen. Black then moved the rook to b4, intending to stack the rooks to attack white's pawn on b2. However, Magnus responded by pushing his pawn to b3. Black then moved the king to c8, releasing the pin on the queen. Naturally, Magnus captured the queen with the rook, and it was recaptured by the pawn. Magnus then made a brilliant move, capturing the black bishop on e6 with his rook, which was again recaptured by the pawn. Magnus then moved his queen to f8, delivering a check while also forking the rook and the king. At this point, Torstein Bae resigned. It was clear that if the game continued, for example, with the king moving to d7, white would capture the rook with the queen, then support the promotion of the pawn with rook to e8. White's queen would move to a4, delivering a check. Black's king would move to d8, and white's queen would capture the pawn on a7. It's obvious that white would win. You might wonder why Torstein resigned so quickly, despite still having a rook and many pawns that could promote. The reason lies in the material quality where white had a clear advantage. Most importantly, the opponent was Magnus Carlsen, a player known for his near-perfect play and mastery of the endgame. That's all for today's video. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell for more interesting chess videos. See you in the next chess video.